Chapter 7. Remembering her judo training, Nancy tucked her head, wrapped her arms around her chest, and relaxed her muscles. She hit hard on her right shoulder at the grassy edge of the road. The force of the impact sent her rolling down an embankment. At last she came to a halt, stopped by a thick hedge of wild blackberry bushes. The thorns scratched through her thin windbreaker and clung to her as she tried to pull away. She stopped fighting and lay still for a moment, catching her breath. "Nancy!" Barb ran down the embankment. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said calmly, "except I'm being attacked by a bush." "How can you joke at a time like this?" Barb knelt down and began to pull the thorns from Nancy's clothes. As soon as she was free, Nancy slid away from the hedge and sat up slowly. "No broken bones, just a few bruises. I'm glad I was wearing a helmet. Did you get a look at that motorcycle?" "Only a glimpse, but I'm sure I'd recognize it if I saw it again," Barb said. "It was black, with a yellow streak of lightning painted on the side. I couldn't see the driver's face because he was wearing a dark helmet visor." Nancy stood up. "Is my moped wrecked?" "I didn't stop to check." "Are you sure you can walk?" Barb asked anxiously. "Yes, I'm fine," Nancy said. "Come on, let's go. I want to find the idiot who hit me." When they found Nancy's moped, it was lying on its side, still running, the rear wheel spinning uselessly. They checked it over. It was dented and scraped, but still rideable. "Let's head for town," Nancy said. "That's the most likely place he'd go, to try to lose himself in a crowd." "I can't believe anyone wouldn't stop to see if you were all right." "They call it hit and run," Nancy said grimly. "The question is," she added to herself, was the attack deliberate? Unless he was incredibly incompetent, why had he hit her when he had room to pass, a dry road, and no traffic in sight? "I want to find that guy," she said to herself. They rode back to Old Harbor, scanning the traffic as they went. Finally, Barb said, "I'm beginning to think it's useless. He could be anywhere on the island by now. Or even off the island if he caught a ferry." Nancy checked her watch. "It's 3:25. What time does the ferry leave?" "There's one at 3:30, Barb said. "Hurry, let's get down to the dock." By the time they worked their way through the traffic, the ferry's whistle was blowing, signaling its departure. Nancy and Barb jumped off their mopeds and ran toward it, but were stopped by the barrier at the end of the pier. "Did you see someone with a black motorcycle board the boat?" Nancy asked the girl who collected tickets at the barrier. "It had a streak of yellow lightning painted on the side." "Yeah, sharp machine," the girl said, chewing gum. "Please, I've got to talk to the driver. Can you let me through?" Nancy said. "Got a ticket?" the girl asked. "No, but—" "No ticket, you don't get through." The girl snapped her gum. "Those are the rules." Nancy glanced at the ticket office, but the crew was already pulling up the board ramp, and by the time she got back it would be too late. She pressed forward, straining at the barrier, trying to spot the motorcycle. "I think I see it," Barb said, excited. "Look on the right, beside the blue car." "You're right," Nancy said, "and look who's standing next to the motorcycle. Isn't that one of the construction workers on DJ's crew?" "Yes," Barb said. "Didn't DJ call him Hank?" Nancy cupped her hands around her mouth. "Hey, Hank!" she shouted. "Hank!" The man, who was short, with a dark suntan, saw her. Surprised, he pushed his way to the stern of the ferry. "What do you want?" "You sideswiped my moped!" Nancy yelled. Hank laughed. Most of his answer was drowned out by the ferry's whistle as it pulled away from the dock. All Nancy heard was, "Crazy dumb tourist, why don't you learn how to ride?" He turned and disappeared into the crowd of passengers. Frustrated, Nancy watched the ferry move out to open water. She pounded her fist on the barrier. "He's not going to get away with this. I'm going to report him to the police. They can have someone pick him up when he arrives at Point Judith." They rode over to the police station. Jim smiled when he saw Nancy, but he became serious as he listened to her story. "The road was perfectly clear," Nancy finished. There was no reason for him to hit me.
This doesn't sound good, Jim frowned. Fill out a report, and I'll call the mainland right away.
Nancy wrote out a detailed report. Jim told her to check back around 5 after the ferry had docked. Nancy, I've got to stop by the Nature Conservancy office, Barb said as they went out of the police station. Okay, I think I'd better take my moped to the rental shop. It's making a funny noise, and I should tell them about the accident. She waved goodbye to Barb. By the time Nancy dealt with the insurance claims and exchanged her moped for another, it was close to 5 o'clock. She returned to the police station. Jim shook his head when he saw her come in.
It's the strangest thing, he said. The guy you're looking for seems to have vanished. A state trooper boarded the ferry as soon as it docked, ready to pick up whoever claimed the motorcycle. No one showed up. The guy must have walked off the boat with the other passengers, leaving his cycle behind.
You're kidding, Nancy said, amazed. It's practically a brand new bike. Nancy paused, staring at the large map of the island on the wall. That confirms it. I'm sure he meant to hit me.
There's no doubt something fishy's going on, Jim said. I'll check with DJ Divot since he hired the guy. I'll get a last name, address, and so on. Don't worry, we'll pick him up soon.
Thanks, Jim. Nancy walked out to her moped and stood there in the cold wind, thinking. Hank had just walked off the ferry. No one would abandon an almost new motorcycle unless someone had paid him enough to make it worth his while. But who might have paid Hank to run her off the road? DJ? If he killed Tom, he had a good reason to stop her from investigating the case. Just because Barb was sure he was innocent didn't mean he was. Then, too, anyone at the construction site could have heard DJ shouting that she was a detective. What had happened next? Nancy thought back. Scott had left soon afterward. In fact, it sounded as if he'd made up an excuse to leave. And before he left, he had spoken to some of the workers. Was Hank one of them? Nancy couldn't remember. She shook her head. According to DJ, Scott was the last person to see Tom alive. But why would Scott kill Tom? As far as Nancy was concerned, it all came back to the money. Where and how had Tom gotten it? Who had plenty of money to give to him for whatever he was doing? Scott Winchester, for one. Nancy shivered as the wind whipped reddish-blonde curls off her neck. The sky was low and gray overhead, and it appeared as if the storm was moving in fast. She wondered if Scott had returned to the yacht where he and his father lived. Great Salt Pond, where they were anchored, was just down the road from the police station. She decided to take a look. She rode the short distance and strolled out to the end of their dock. All over the harbor, people were preparing for the storm. Those whose boats were tied to the piers were busy doubling up on their docking lines. Canvas awnings were removed, lines wrapped around the sail covers, fuel and water tanks filled. Dinghies bustled back and forth on the pond as supplies were ferried out to the moorings. Nancy checked to her left, where a longer dock stretched out into the huge harbor. She spotted Walt Winchester striding past a line of cabin cruisers and sailboats. He reached a ladder and climbed down, untying a dinghy. Nancy's eyes were then drawn to a white yacht moored about 200 yards in front of her. The yacht was at least 50 feet long, with lovely clean lines. The name, painted on the stern in gold letters, was Emily Sue. As she watched, someone in a yellow hooded slicker ran out on the yacht's deck, climbed into an old wooden rowboat tied to the stern, and quickly pulled away. Nancy lost track of it as it zigzagged among the many anchored boats. Walt Winchester had started up the small outboard motor on his dinghy. He set a course straight for the white yacht. The rowboat reappeared from behind a small sloop and headed for a narrow beach on Nancy's left. Just as it pulled ashore, a gust of wind blew back the hood of the slicker, and Nancy saw that it was Angie. 2 kids were sitting on the dock several feet away from her. One of them turned around, and she saw it was Ashley Hannah, the pretty, dark-haired girl from the ferry. "Hi, Nancy," she called out. What are you doing here?
Just admiring the boats, Nancy answered. Do you know who owns the yacht Emily Sue? She pointed it out.
No, but maybe my cousin does, said Ashley.
Sure, that's Congressman Winchester's boat, the older boy said. He and his son live on it.
Thanks, Nancy said, frowning. So Walt was definitely headed for his yacht, and it seemed as if Angie had left the very same boat in a hurry. Angie, who refused to wait on the Winchesters in the restaurant. Angie, who had once dated Scott Winchester and now apparently hated him. What in the world had she been doing on the Emily Sue?